It was late October 1943, and what intelligence officers had promised would be a routine bombing run was turning into something far more dangerous. Arooth manned one of the waist gun positions aboard the heavy bomber. His weapon, a large caliber machine gun, sat mounted on a simple stand that allowed him to swing it across a wide arc. The gun weighed more than 80 pounds and required all his strength to move and aim. Inside the aircraft, the temperature had dropped to 20 degrees below zero. Outside, where the wind screamed past at nearly 200 miles per hour, it was 60 below dots. The waist gun position was essentially a large rectangular opening cut directly into the aluminum skin of the fuselage. No glass, no enclosure, nothing to block the freezing wind. Through this opening, Arooth could traverse his weapon through roughly half a circle, covering the sides and rear portions of the aircraft. He wore multiple layers of clothing, fleece-lined leather over wool uniforms, electrically heated vest, oxygen mask, and thick gloves that were thin enough to let him feel the trigger, but thick enough to prevent his fingers from freezing to the metal. This was Arooth's third combat mission. He had enlisted in early 1942, just months after Pearl Harbor, joining from his home in Connecticut. His test scores had qualified him for gunnery training after the pilot school. 4 months, he had learned every detail of his weapon at training facilities across the American Southwest. He could take the gun apart and reassemble it blindfolded. He knew it fired roughly 800 rounds per minute and was effective against aircraft out to about 1,000 yards, though accuracy dropped significantly beyond 600. But nothing in training had prepared him for the reality of combat at high altitude over enemy territory. Training had taken place in warm weather, at low altitude, firing at predictable targets that didn't shoot back. This was entirely different. The cold wasn't just uncomfortable, it was life-threatening. Exposed skin froze within seconds. Gun oil could thicken and cause malfunctions. Even the ammunition could become so cold it failed to fire properly. Arooth had learned on his previous missions that his role was as much about being a target as being a warrior. The thin aluminum walls of the fuselage offered virtually no protection against enemy cannon fire. When German fighters attacked, he stood at his weapon and fired back because it was his duty, and because doing something was marginally better than doing nothing. But he understood that survival was largely a matter of chance. The mission briefing that morning had begun before dawn. An officer had pulled back a curtain to reveal a map with a red line stretching from England across the North Sea to Bremen. The target was an aircraft factory producing enemy fighters. Intelligence predicted moderate fighter opposition and heavy anti-aircraft fire over the target. The entire mission would take roughly 7 hours. Fighter escorts would accompany them partway, but their range was limited. Eventually, the bombers would be on their own. Arooth's aircraft was part of a larger formation, more than 200 bombers attacking targets across northern Germany. His crew consisted of 9 men who had trained together and flown their first mission together just weeks earlier. Each man knew his job and trusted the others, but they were still learning the harsh lessons that separated training exercises from actual combat. The weapon Arooth operated was fed from ammunition boxes containing linked cartridges in a specific sequence. 1 armor-piercing round, 1 incendiary round, 1 tracer round, repeated throughout. The armor-piercing rounds had steel cores designed to penetrate aircraft structures. The incendiary rounds contained small charges that ignited on impact, potentially starting fires in fuel tanks or engines. The tracer rounds burned brightly, allowing the gunner to see where his bullets were going. Each waist position carried 400 rounds of ready ammunition, with additional supplies stored elsewhere in the aircraft for resupply during combat. At 800 rounds per minute, a gunner firing continuously could exhaust his immediately available ammunition in just 30 seconds. Fire discipline was critical. Gunners learned to fire only when they had a reasonable chance of hitting, to fire in short bursts to conserve ammunition and prevent the barrel from overheating, and to call out enemy positions over the intercom to alert other crew members. but the waist gun had significant limitations. The mount was entirely manual, moved only by the gunner's physical strength. An enemy fighter in a high-speed attack could cross the field of view in just seconds. Tracking such a target required anticipation and considerable practice. The gun had no computing sight, no mechanism to help calculate the lead angle necessary to hit a moving target. The gunner aimed by instinct and experience, pointing the weapon where he thought the target would be when the bullets arrived, not where it currently was. Most successful aerial gunnery occurred at ranges of 300 yards or less, distances where the gunner could see the target clearly and where bullet travel time was short enough that the target's evasive maneuvers had limited effect. Beyond that range, hitting a maneuvering fighter became extremely difficult. By mid-morning, the engines had started and the formation had assembled over England, climbing to altitude and forming the tight combat formation that would carry them across the North Sea. Arooth stood at his gun, watching the English countryside disappear beneath clouds, feeling the temperature continue to drop, checking his oxygen flow, testing his heated suit, going through mental checklists that had become routine. The Dutch coast appeared beneath broken clouds late in the morning. The formation was at 15,000 feet, still climbing toward their assigned altitude for the bomb run. Friendly fighter escorts were visible above and to the sides, their distinctive shapes recognizable against the sky. The first anti-aircraft fire appeared soon after. Black bursts dotted the sky ahead. German batteries knew the altitudes American bombers typically used and the routes they usually flew. They fired predicted patterns, filling volumes of sky with exploding shells, rather than attempting to track individual aircraft. The bomber formation flew through these fields of fire. The aircraft shook with near misses. Arooth heard metal fragments hitting the fuselage, sharp impacts, like hail on a tin roof. Then the tail gunner's voice crackled over the intercom, reporting enemy fighters climbing from behind and above. The top turret gunner confirmed, identifying them as single-engine fighters. These aircraft maintained their position behind and above the formation, shadowing the bombers, reporting their location and heading to German fighter control. They were marking the formation for a heavier fighters that would make the actual attacks within the hour. The friendly escorts turned back, waggling their wings in farewell before diving toward England and their bases. The bombers were now beyond the range of friendly fighters. From here to the target and most of the way back, they would rely entirely on their own defensive weapons. The navigator's voice came over the intercom, announcing 30 minutes to the initial point, the location where the formation would turn onto the bomb run. From that point to bomb release, the formation would fly straight and level, maintaining precise altitude and heading so the bombardier could aim properly. It was the most dangerous portion of any mission, the time when the bombers were most vulnerable to both anti-aircraft fire and fighter attack. Shortly after 11 in the morning, the formation turned onto the bomb run. Ahead, Arooth could see the industrial haze of Bremen. He could see black smudges of anti-aircraft bursts beginning to appear at their altitude. And then he saw the enemy fighters. 12 aircraft emerged from the direction of the sun, positioned directly ahead of the bomber formation at the same altitude. These were heavier, more powerful fighters than the ones that had been shadowing them. They were built around large radial engines and carried for machine guns plus the cannon. More importantly, they were flown by experienced pilots who had been flying combat 4 years. The heavy bomber that Arooth flew in had evolved considerably since the war began. The original design from the late 1930s had been built around a specific philosophy. It would fly at high altitude, protected by its own defensive weapons, rather than by fighter escorts. The name Flying Fortress reflected this concept. The bomber would be its own fortress, armed with enough guns to defend itself. Early models had proven this theory flawed. They were inadequately armed and vulnerable to determined fighter attack. Subsequent versions added more gun positions and heavier weapons. The model Arooth flew carried multiple 50 caliber machine guns and one 30 caliber gun distributed across several positions: nose, top turret, ball turret underneath, tail, and the two waist positions. But this model retained a critical weakness that German pilots exploited ruthlessly. The nose armament was limited. The bombardier had a single 50 caliber gun on a flexible mount. The navigator had access to one 30 caliber gun. Two additional 30 caliber guns were mounted in cheek positions on either side of the nose compartment. This armament could engage fighters approaching from ahead, but it wasn't sufficient to deter mass frontal attacks. German tactical doctrine had evolved rapidly. Initially, their fighters primarily attacked from the rear and sides, positions where they could use their speed and maneuverability to close, fire, and break away. But American gunners became proficient at defending against these attacks. The tail gunner had an excellent field of fire directly behind. The ball turret gunner could engage targets below and to the sides. The waist gunners covered the beam positions with overlapping fields of fire. The top turret could traverse through a complete circle and elevate to engage targets above and to the sides. By mid-1943, German pilots recognized that attacking from the rear or sides of a bomber formation, facing concentrated defensive fire from multiple gunners who had trained extensively for exactly this scenario. The mathematics of aerial gunnery was unforgiving. A bomber in formation was rarely alone. It flew in a combat formation with other bombers arranged, so their defensive fire overlapped. A fighter attacking from behind might face fire from a dozen or more heavy machine guns simultaneously. The German solution was the head-on attack. Approaching from directly ahead, the fighter pilots exploited the weak nose armament. The bombardier and navigator, both occupied with their primary duties during the bomb run, had limited time and training for aerial gunnery. The cheek guns had restricted fields of fire and were difficult to aim accurately. A determined pilot could approach from dead ahead, fire a concentrated burst into the bomber's nose, cockpit, and forward fuselage, then break away before the more heavily armed positions could bring effective fire to bear. This tactic was dangerous for the German pilots. The closing speed between a bomber flying at 180 miles per hour and a fighter attacking at 350 miles per hour exceeded 500 miles per hour. The fighter pilot had perhaps 3 seconds to aim, fire, and break away before a collision became inevitable. But the tactic was effective. Bombers began going down with their cockpits destroyed, their pilots killed or wounded, their nose compartments shredded by cannon fire. Arooth was 21 years old that October. He had scored well on mechanical aptitude tests, but not high enough for pilot training. The recruiters had offered him aerial gunnery school instead. His training had followed a standardized curriculum. Students learned the weapon in exhaustive detail. They practiced on ground ranges, firing at stationary targets, then at moving targets. Advanced training involved aerial gunnery from actual aircraft, firing at fabric sleeves towed behind other planes, learning to lead a moving target and account for relative motion. But nothing in that training had prepared him for this. Training had occurred at low altitude in warm weather. Students wore light flying suits. They fired without the burden of heavy fleece-lined jackets, oxygen masks, and electrically heated suits. The targets moved predictably in straight lines. There was no return fire. There was no fear. The reality was entirely different. At 15,000 feet over northern Germany in October, the air temperature was 60 degrees below zero. Arooth wore multiple layers, long underwear, wool uniform, fleece-lined leather pants and jacket, leather gloves with wool liners, fleece-lined boots, and a leather flying helmet. Over this, he wore a vest with electrically heated wiring running through the fabric, powered by the aircraft's electrical system. An oxygen mask covered his nose and mouth, delivering oxygen from bottles stored in the fuselage. Without oxygen at this altitude, he would lose consciousness within minutes. The cold wasn't merely uncomfortable, it was actively dangerous. Exposed skin froze in seconds. Moisture from breath could freeze oxygen masks to faces, tearing skin when removed. Gun oil could thicken, causing weapons to malfunction. Ammunition could become so cold that rounds failed to fire. Gunners learned to fire short bursts to prevent barrels from overheating and warping. but they also had to keep firing often enough to prevent the guns from freezing. The waist gun position was particularly brutal. Unlike enclosed positions, the waist windows were completely open to the elements. The wind screamed through 180 miles per hour, creating noise that made communication nearly impossible even with the intercom system. The wind chill was incomprehensible. Men developed frostbite within minutes of reaching altitude. Some lost fingers and toes during long missions. On his previous missions, Arooth had learned the fundamental reality of his position. He stood in an aluminum tube protected by metal barely a quarter-inch thick at its thickest points. A cannon shell could penetrate this with ease. The explosive charge would detonate inside the fuselage, sending metal fragments through the confined space. There was no armor protecting him. There was no cover. When enemy fighters attacked, he returned fire because that was his job and because it was marginally better than not returning fire. But he understood that survival was largely a matter of chance. The German formation began its attack run. Arooth could see them growing larger as they closed, could see the distinctive radial engines and wide wings. The combined closing speed exceeded 500 miles per hour. In 90 seconds they would be firing. In 2 minutes they would flash past the formation or through it. The co-pilot's voice came over the intercom, tense with urgency, reporting fighters directly ahead at the same level, closing fast. The bombardier responded that he saw them. The top turret gunner reported that he couldn't depress his guns low enough to engage them during a head-on approach. The bull turret gunner added that he had no angle from his position. The tail gunner was useless against a frontal attack. The cheek gunners in the nose had limited fields of fire and were difficult to aim effectively. The entire defensive firepower of the bomber against a head-on attack came down to the bombardier's single 50 caliber gun and 2 30 caliber cheek guns. Against 12 enemy fighters, it was inadequate. Arooth made a decision that wasn't in any manual he had read, not covered in any training he had received. He grabbed his gun and rotated it forward, pointing it as far toward the nose of the aircraft as the mount would allow. The waist window was positioned roughly halfway between nose and tail. The window opening faced perpendicular to the aircraft's length, designed to give the gunner a field of fire covering the sides. But by rotating the gun forward and leaning into the opening, exposing himself to the wind, Arooth found he could point the weapon at an angle perhaps 45 degrees forward of the beam. It wasn't a proper firing position. The angle was wrong. The gun wasn't designed for this. He had no good sight picture. The wind tore at his oxygen mask and helmet, but he could see the German fighters approaching, and he could fire. The enemy fighters opened fire at approximately 800 yards. Arooth could see muzzle flashes from their wing-mounted weapons. He could see smoke trails from their rounds. Then he saw strikes on the bomber flying ahead and to the left of his own aircraft. Pieces of material flew off the bomber's nose. The aircraft staggered, dropped slightly, then recovered. Arooth opened fire. He was firing at an angle outside his assigned defensive sector. He was firing at a range where hitting anything was improbable. He was firing before the enemy fighters had reached what instructors would consider effective range. He was violating every rule of fire discipline he had been taught. But he was putting bullets into the air in front of the attacking fighters. He wasn't alone. On the left side of the aircraft, the other waist gunner had the same idea. Both waist gunners, operating independently without coordination, simultaneously decided that the doctrinal approach was inadequate for the situation they faced. The effect wasn't what Arooth expected. He didn't see his tracers strike any of the German fighters. He didn't see any fighters explode or smoke or fall out of formation. But he saw something else. He saw one of the fighters break off its attack run early, rolling away to the right and diving. Then another broke left. The remaining fighters continued their run, flashing past the bombers at a combined closure rate exceeding 500 miles per hour, so close that Arooth could see the pilots in their cockpits. The German fighters fired as they passed. Cannon rounds and machine gun bullets ripped through the formation. The bomber ahead and to the left took multiple hits. Arooth saw one of its engines begin trailing smoke. Another bomber had its entire nose section shattered. The bombardier was killed instantly. The navigator was wounded, but the bomber stayed in formation. Then the fighters were passed, climbing away, setting up for another attack. Arooth's gun was hot. He had fired perhaps 75 rounds in sustained bursts. The barrel was warm enough that he could feel heat radiating from it even through his gloves. He checked his ammunition supply. He had gone through nearly a quarter of his immediately available rounds in a single firing pass. The intercom came alive with voices. Damage reports. Casualty reports. The other waist gunner reported that his oxygen hose had been severed by a bullet or fragment. The co-pilot ordered him to plug into the emergency oxygen bottle immediately. Arooth looked out his window and saw the enemy fighters repositioning for another head-on pass. They had climbed to a position ahead and above the formation. They were setting up for an attack diving through the formation from above and ahead, maximizing their speed advantage and their ability to fire while presenting a difficult angle for the bomber gunners. This time Arooth was ready. He rotated his gun forward again, elevated the barrel, and waited. He could see the fighters beginning their dive. He could see them growing larger as they closed. At what he estimated was 1,000 yards. He began firing, the machine gun at maximum elevation, fired from the waist position at targets approaching from ahead and above, created an entirely new defensive capability. The bullets arced upward and forward, creating a cone of fire that the attacking fighters had to fly through. Arooth wasn't aiming at a specific aircraft. He was firing into the space where the fighters would be, creating a barrier of bullets that forced the German pilots to either fly through it or break off their attack. The fighters broke off before reaching effective firing range. The others continued, firing their weapons, hitting multiple bombers in the formation. Then they were passed again, and Arooth was reloading, pulling fresh ammunition containers from storage, fitting the belt into the feed mechanism, charging the weapon. The tail gunner's voice came over the intercom, reporting they were forming up for another pass. He counted the aircraft. 10. 2 of the original 12 were missing. Arooth didn't know if his fire had hit anything. He had no way to confirm. But the fighters out of the original 12 were no longer participating in the attacks. Whether they had been hit, whether they had mechanical problems, whether their pilots had simply decided the defensive fire was too intense, he had no way of knowing. What he knew was that firing his waist gun forward, outside its designed defensive sector, was having some effect on the German attack pattern. The bombardier's voice cut through the intercom chatter, announcing 30 seconds to bomb release. The formation held its course. The aircraft rocked from anti-aircraft bursts. The enemy fighters repositioned for another attack. Arooth stood at his gun, scanning the sky, waiting. The bombs fell away shortly after 11:30. Arooth felt the aircraft lift slightly as thousands of pounds of high explosive ordnance dropped from the bomb bay. The bombardier called confirmation over the intercom. The formation began a slow turn to the left, away from Bremen, heading back toward the North Sea and England. The enemy fighters attacked again. This time they came from multiple directions simultaneously. A coordinated assault designed to overwhelm the formation's defensive fire. 4 fighters attacked from ahead and above. 3 more came in from the right side. The remaining 3 attacked from behind and below, climbing up into the formation's vulnerable underside. Arooth engaged the fighters approaching from his side. He fired at one, making a beam attack from directly right, leading the target, walking his tracers toward the fighter. He saw his round strike the fighter's wing. Pieces of metal flew off. The fighter rolled inverted and dove away, trailing smoke. He rotated his gun forward to engage the fighters attacking from ahead. The other waist gunner was firing continuously at the fighters attacking from behind and below. The top turret was traversing rapidly, engaging multiple targets. The bull turret gunner was firing at the fighters attacking from underneath. The tail gunner was calling out positions and firing at fighters making rear attacks after their initial passes. The noise was overwhelming. Multiple heavy machine guns firing simultaneously created sound that penetrated even the engine roar and wind noise. The aircraft vibrated from the recoil. Spent cartridge cases clattered across the deck plating. The smell of burned gunpowder filled the fuselage even at altitude, where the air was thin and cold. An enemy fighter attacking from directly ahead fired a burst that hit one of the engines. The engine began streaming white vapor that instantly froze in the -60-degree air. The pilot shut down the engine and adjusted the propeller. The bomber could fly on 3 engines, but it would struggle to maintain altitude and formation position. Arooth fired at another fighter, approaching from ahead and slightly high. His tracers converged on the fighter's nose section. He saw strikes on the engine housing. The fighter's propeller stopped rotating. The engine had been hit. The fighter nosed over and began diving away from the formation, trailing black smoke. The attacks continued for 17 minutes. The German fighters made pass after pass, attacking from different angles, trying to isolate damaged bombers from the formation. 3 bombers fell out of formation during this period. One was on fire, its wing engulfed in flames. The crew bailed out, white parachutes opening against the dark landscape below. Another lost 2 engines and began a slow descent. The third simply exploded, a direct hit that detonated remaining ordnance. Then, as suddenly as they had appeared, the German fighters broke off the attack. Arooth watched them turn away and dive toward their bases. His gun barrel was so hot he could see heat shimmer rising from it. He had fired over 400 rounds. His shoulders ached from manhandling the 84-pound weapon. His hands were cramped from gripping the handles. His ears rang despite the leather flying helmet. His oxygen mask was partially frozen from his breath condensing and freezing in the -60-degree air. The formation continued westward. The damaged bomber with the shut-down engine struggled to keep up but maintained its position. Shortly after noon, friendly fighters appeared, escort meeting them for the return flight across the North Sea. The presence of friendly fighters meant the German attacks were over. The bombers were safe, or as safe as they could be while still over occupied territory with hundreds of miles to fly before reaching England. Arooth stood at his gun, scanning the sky, but his mind was processing what had just happened. He had fired his waist gun forward, engaging fighters attacking from ahead, a use of the weapon that violated its design specifications and the tactical doctrine he had been trained to follow. And it had worked. He couldn't confirm how many fighters he had hit. The chaos of air combat made such confirmation nearly impossible for waist gunners, but he had seen at least 2 fighters break off or go down after his fire struck them. More importantly, he had seen other fighters break off their attacks early, before reaching effective firing range, deterred by the volume of defensive fire coming from angles they hadn't expected. The waist guns, pointed forward and elevated, created a cone of fire that disrupted the German attack pattern. The formation began landing in mid-afternoon. Arooth's aircraft touched down, with 1 engine shut down and multiple holes in the fuselage from cannon and machine gun fire. The crew climbed out stiffly, their bodies aching from 7 hours at altitude in sub-zero temperatures. An intelligence officer met them for debriefing. Arooth reported his engagement of fighters from the waist position, firing forward at angles outside his assigned defensive sector. The officer noted this in his report. Arooth claimed 2 fighters destroyed and possibly a 3rd damaged. The claims would be reviewed and compared against reports from other crew members and other aircraft. Aerial victory claims were notoriously difficult to confirm. Multiple gunners often fired at the same target. A fighter that appeared to be going down might recover after leaving the immediate battle area. After reviewing all reports from the mission, the authorities credited Arooth with 2 confirmed victories and 1 probable. The confirmation process was stringent, requiring corroborating evidence from other crew members. But Arooth's claims were supported by the other waist gunner who had witnessed the engagements from his position, and by the top turret gunner who had seen at least 1 of the fighters go down smoking as Arooth's fire struck it. to confirmed aerial victories in a single mission was exceptional for any aerial gunner. What was more significant was what happened in the weeks and months that followed. Arooth's technique of rotating the waist gun forward to engage head-on attacks was discussed in crew meetings and tactical briefings. Other waist gunners began experimenting with similar techniques. The innovation spread through bomber groups throughout the force. By December 1943, waist gunners were routinely engaging fighters attacking from the forward hemisphere, using their guns at extreme angles to create defensive fire that disrupted German attack patterns. The technique was never officially sanctioned in training manuals or tactical doctrine. It remained an improvisation, a field modification to tactics, rather than a designed capability. But it worked, and in combat, what worked mattered more than what the manual specified. The tactical innovation was overtaken by technological change. Aircraft manufacturers had already begun production of a new variant that addressed the nose armament deficiency that had made head-on attacks so effective. The new model added a powered turret beneath the nose, mounting to 50 caliber machine guns that could be aimed by the bombardier. This gave the bomber genuine defensive firepower against frontal attacks. The first new models arrived in England in September 1943. By early 1944, they were replacing older models in combat groups. The chin turret, combined with existing cheek guns and the bombardier's flexible nose gun, gave the bomber multiple heavy machine guns that could engage targets in the forward hemisphere. German pilots found that head-on attacks against the new models were far more costly than attacks against earlier versions. But the new models also incorporated another change to the waist gun positions. The waist windows were staggered, offset from each other, rather than positioned directly opposite on both sides. This staggered arrangement gave each waist gunner more room to operate and significantly better fields of fire toward the front of the aircraft. A waist gunner in the new model could more easily rotate his gun forward and engage targets in the forward quarter. The modification wasn't designed specifically to enable the technique that Arooth and other gunners had improvised, but it facilitated that technique, making it easier and more effective. The staggered waist windows became standard on all subsequent production, and thousands of aircraft were built with this feature before production ended. Michael Arooth completed his combat tour of 25 missions in February 1944. He was awarded medals for his actions on the October mission and subsequent operations. He returned to the United States in March 1944 and spent the remainder of the war as a gunnery instructor in Texas, teaching new aerial gunners the techniques he had learned in combat over Germany. After the war, Arooth returned to Connecticut. He worked as a machinist, married, raised 3 children, and rarely spoke about his combat experiences. Like many veterans, he found that the intensity of aerial combat over Germany was difficult to communicate to people who hadn't experienced it. The terror, the cold, the noise, the smell of gunpowder and fear. These weren't things that translated well into peacetime conversation. The story of waist gunners engaging head-on fighter attacks became part of the larger narrative of innovation and adaptation in the air war over Europe. It was a small tactical development, limited in scope, but it illustrated a principle that characterized military success throughout the conflict. When faced with problems, forces at all levels, from individual crew members to strategic commanders, improvised solutions. Official doctrine said waist guns covered the sides and rear quarters. Reality said that when 12 enemy fighters attacked from dead ahead, every gun that could be brought to bear mattered. Arooth and countless other waist gunners recognized this reality and adapted accordingly. They used their weapons in ways the designers hadn't intended, violating the neat defensive sectors that looked logical on paper, but proved inadequate in combat. The German fighters faced an enemy that refused to be predictable. When head-on attacks proved effective against bombers with weak nose armament, the response came not just by adding turrets to new aircraft, but by training existing crews to use their existing weapons more creatively. Waist gunners firing forward wasn't a complete solution to the problem, but it was a partial solution immediately available, requiring no new equipment or extensive modification. This adaptability extended throughout the campaign. When bomber losses proved unsustainable, long-range fighter escorts were developed. When existing escorts lacked range to accompany bombers all the way to targets deep in Germany, new fighters with extended range were produced. When German fighters developed new tactics, crews developed counter-tactics. The industrial capacity that produced tens of thousands of tanks also produced more than 12,000 heavy bombers. The same organizational ability that coordinated invasions across two oceans also coordinated bombing campaigns involving thousands of aircraft striking hundreds of targets, and the same innovative spirit that led a 21-year-old waist gunner from Connecticut to point his gun forward and fire it. Attacking fighters also led to countless other small improvements and adaptations that cumulatively made the difference between defeat and victory. The enemy pilots who attacked American bomber formations were skilled, brave, and experienced. They flew excellent aircraft. They employed sound tactics, but they faced an opponent with material advantages that skill and tactics couldn't overcome. For every bomber shot down, factories built replacements faster than enemy factories could build fighters. For every innovation in tactics, crews developed countermeasures. By late 1944, the enemy was losing the air war over Germany, not because their pilots lacked courage or skill, but because they lacked fuel, aircraft, and time to train new pilots to replace their losses. The Americans could afford losses, terrible as that sounds, because they had the industrial capacity to replace them. Germany couldn't afford equivalent losses because their industrial capacity, strained by years of war and subject to continuous bombing, couldn't keep pace. The moment when Michael Arooth rotated his waist gun forward and fired at attacking fighters was a small moment in an enormous war. One gunner, one gun, one mission among thousands, but it was representative of something larger. It represented an approach to warfare that was flexible, innovative, willing to discard doctrine when reality demanded different solutions. Official histories of the air war over Europe barely mention waist gunners engaging frontal attacks. It was too small a detail, too tactical, too far from the strategic narrative of how bombing contributed to Allied victory. But the men who flew the missions remembered. They remembered that survival often depended on doing things that weren't in the manual, on recognizing that the enemy didn't care what doctrine specified, that combat was ultimately about practical solutions to immediate problems. Arooth died in 1998 at 76. His obituary mentioned his service briefly, noting he had been a waist gunner on bombers and had been awarded medals. It didn't mention the October mission. It didn't describe the moment when he rotated his gun forward and engaged fighters attacking from ahead. These details were known only to his family and to the few surviving members of his crew. But the technique he helped develop, the improvisation of using waist guns to engage frontal attacks, became part of the tactical repertoire. It was taught informally to new crews. It was employed on missions throughout 1944 until new chin turrets made it less necessary, and it represented a truth about warfare that transcended the specific details of bomber defensive tactics. When the rules prove inadequate, competent people adapt. They find new ways to use existing tools. They innovate under pressure. They survive by being smarter, faster, and more flexible than their opponents. This was true for waist gunners over Germany in 1943. It was true for soldiers in every theater of the Second World War. It remains true in every conflict.